morning, everyone. My name is Oscar Hernandez. I work at Risk Management Professionals. Thank you for taking the time to join us on this webinar. Today we'll be going over efficient compliance audit, how to balance your time as well as resources. Here's a list of RMP's key services. I'm sure a lot of you viewing this presentation are familiar with RMP and what we do. This slide is a breakdown of what we consider some of our core competencies. If you would like more information on any of these subjects, I would recommend looking at our website at rmpcorp.com to see a full list of services that we can provide for you. Here's a quick outline of what's going to be discussed today. First, we'll get into some of the regulatory requirements, then the compliance audit timeline, including preparation, implementation, and finalization, some common deficiencies, as well as tips for streamlining and interviewing techniques. So the reason we perform compliance audit is to abide by the regulatory requirements listed by the California Accidental Release Prevention Program, or CalARP, which is listed for both Program 2 and 3, as well as the U.S. EPA Risk Management Program for Programs 2 and 3, and the OSHA Process Safety Management Plan, or OSHA PSM. So here's an overview of the compliance audit requirements. The CalARP, RMP, and PSM program have nearly identical requirements. You want to make sure that there's a triannual evaluation of compliance, so that has to be done every 3 years. During the compliance audit, you want to make sure that there's at least one person that's knowledgeable in the process, and it's also nice to have someone who's knowledgeable about the regulations. That way they can determine if whether or not you're in compliance. You want to also address you want to document any findings with the compliance audit and jot down any recommendations that resulted from any deficiencies. So that's how you typically address the deficiencies. And you want to make sure that you retain the 2 most recent audit reports. And it's always a good idea to take a look at your 2 most recent audit reports to ensure that all the previous recommendations have been closed out. Here are the required elements by the CalARP RMP PSM program. You have the submittal, the management program, the hazard assessment, the prevention program, as well as the emergency response program. One thing to note is that the compliance audit regulation does not explicitly state that you have to review anything other than the prevention program. However, I would highly encourage facilities to take a look at your submittal, your management program, as well as the hazard assessment and the emergency response program, because when an EPA or OSHA auditor comes in, they're going to want to take a look at those as well. So this table goes over the different program elements required for the CalARP RMP PSM program and shows that the compliance audit is required by all 3 regulatory agencies, which is highlighted in red. The program are pretty much identical and require all of the same elements, including the compliance audit. So the compliance audit is typically done in 3 phases. You have the preparation, the implementation, and finalization, which documents the deficiencies and organizes an action tracking log to make sure that any recommendations are properly closed out. And we'll get into these in the next few slides. So during the preparation stage, you want to make sure that you define an agenda and schedule ahead of time. Typically, it's done about a week in advance. During that agenda, you develop the schedules with appropriate individuals who will be required for the compliance audit, as well as a preliminary review of the RMP prevention program elements. During the implementation phase, or the on-site compliance audit session, you want to first start off by conducting a coordination meeting. The coordination meeting typically goes over the objectives of the compliance audit, reviews any changes to the process, if any, and defines any key stakeholders. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure that the appropriate personnel are present and at a minimum have at least one person knowledgeable about the process. You also want to make sure that you perform a complete walkdown of the covered process, and that's typically done to verify operating procedures with an operator, as well as verify P&ID accuracy. And it also gives you a general idea of the well-keeping or the mechanical integrity of the equipment. You also, while you're doing the compliance audit, you want to utilize a method to document the compliance audit results. We'd like to do that via a compliance audit worksheet, which I'll give you an example of what we use in the next couple slides. As well as you want to document and review and conduct interviews with personnel to make any note of field observations. And after the compliance session is done, you want to conduct a closeout meeting to go over all the recommendations generated from the compliance audit. So for your compliance audit checklist, you want to ensure that every regulatory requirement is addressed for the specific CalARP RMP PSM program that you're auditing. You want to make sure that it includes a records of the participants and that it's an efficient method to document the deficiencies as well as the findings for the compliance audit. And you also want to ensure that it allows for easy recommendation follow-up. During the preparation phase, you want to make sure that you define an agenda and schedule to make sure that appropriate personnel are scheduled to be present. So for example, if your facility has a dedicated maintenance department, you want to make sure that a representative from the maintenance department is present to discuss, since they will be the most familiar with your mechanical integrity program. Additionally, by having a agenda and schedule, it gives the facility time to gather all the prevention programs in a single location, and that way when you're on site during the compliance audit, you're not wasting time trying to find where things are located. And if the facility has electronics of their CalARP RMP PSM program, they can also send them over before you go on site, and that'll reduce the time needed by giving you a preliminary review of the program elements. So here's an example of what our compliance audit checklist looks like. On the left, we have the regulatory references and where you can find the regulatory requirement. To the right of it, the requirement is a description of the regulation that is required. Next, to the right of it, you have whether or not the facility is compliant. We have a yes, no, partial, or not applicable. And to the right of that, the findings is where you document how the facility meets that regulatory requirement. And if they're deficient, to the right of that, you can give them a recommendation to address that deficiency and make sure that they are compliant. During our documentation review, we want to make sure that we review all program elements, including any supporting documentation. And the table here lists the program elements, and then we'll get into each individual one in the next couple slides. So for compliance audit best practices, you should not only determine if the regulatory requirements are met, but also address the effectiveness of the program. Just because your facility has a workbook binder or your program binder doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be compliant. You want to make sure that you're keeping up with filling out the proper forms or updating and reviewing the prevention programs as necessary. During the compliance audit, you also have the option to give recommendations or suggestions. Recommendations should be issued when the regulatory requirement is not met, and suggestions should be issued when things are nice to have. You also want to make sure that there's a recommendation tracking and follow through. So if a regulator were to show up, you want to make sure that you have some sort of documentation that indicates that you closed out the recommendation and you included some sort of closure comments and the date at when it was closed. You also want to make sure that you have record retention. This is where a lot of facilities have their most deficient. So say if you're performing any maintenance on the system or any training records, you want to make sure that you keep those and place them in the binder. So now we'll be discussing what to look for in each individual program element. Please note that the elements discussed are requirements for a program level 3, and not all may be applicable for your facility, especially if you're at program 1 or 2. So for the process safety information, you want to look at information pertaining to the hazards of the regulated substance, and typically this is done by looking for the SDS of the covered chemical. You also want to make sure that they converted from the previously MSDS to an SDS. For the information pertaining to the technology of the process, you want to make sure that it includes an overview of the process, the maximum intended inventory, as well as the safe operating limits, or a reference to the location of where you can find these elements. As I said earlier, you want to make sure that the MSDS have been converted to SDSs. You also want to make sure that the process safety information includes a piping and instrumentation diagram, a P&ID, or a block flow diagram. And you want to make sure that during the walkdown, any updates have been captured and included as part of the P&IDs. For the safety information, you want to make sure that also lists out any materials of construction, electrical classification drawings, any design codes and standards, any calculations or explanations of the release system design, as well as the ventilation system design. So in order to save time for the process safety information, you want to make sure that the P&IDs are walked down during the compliance audit to make sure that they've been updated and represent current field conditions. You want to make sure that you pick a representative portion of the system to verify the P&IDs. So for example, if you have a large facility, you don't want to walk the entire P&IDs down. You want to pick a portion of it, say for example 10% of the P&IDs, and determine if whether or not the current field condition is representative of what the P&IDs state. You also want to determine compliance based on a representative section, as I said. The process hazard analysis, or PHA, should be completed for the covered process. You want to make sure that an appropriate methodology and team members were included. At the minimum, you want to make sure that at least an operator who's knowledgeable of the process was present during the PHA. And the PHA should include any issues associated with the facility siting, human factors, external events, as well as any incidents and recommendations. Some methodology that you can use are what-if checklists, as well as the HAZOP methodology. If you live in a high seismic activity zone, you want to also make sure that a separate seismic assessment was completed, especially if you live in California. For the PHA recommendations, you have if you live in California, you have 2.5 years to close them out, and you want to make sure that the PHA has been revalidated on a 5-year interval. So next we'll get into the operating procedures. Operating procedures have to include steps for each operating phase as required by the regulations. You want to make sure that the operating procedures are synchronized with the actions operators are performing out in the field. In order to verify this, you want to pick a operating procedure at random and have the operator demonstrate each operating procedure and make sure that they currently reflect what the operating procedure states. You also want to make sure that the operating procedures are reviewed annually and have a certification sheet that was signed by the operator, by the owner, whoever reviewed them. So some operating procedures time-saving tips. Again, as I said, you want to make sure that you pick a procedure at random and evaluate it for compliance, and that's typically done during the walkdown. You also assume that if the procedure is accurate, it's representative of all the rest of the procedures included as part of their program. So for the training, you want to make sure that there's a training program in place and it's being completed as required by the regulations. Regulations state that you have to have an initial as well as a refresher training, and at a minimum be performed every 3 years or more frequent if needed. So in order to verify this, you want to ask a list of employees who work on the covered process and make sure that they have supporting documentation for their training. If you use a contractor to perform any maintenance or operations of your system, you also want to make sure that you include any training records as part of your documentation. And then the training must be on the operations of the process and must include a method of verification of understanding. So for the mechanical integrity, you want to make sure that there's a preventative maintenance program in place, and it includes all equipment associated with the regulated process. You also want to make sure that there's a formal schedule for maintaining the maintenance on the equipment, and any means used to document the maintenance is being completed as part of the schedule. You also want to make sure that there's a method used to correct any equipment deficiencies and make sure that it's done in a timely manner. So to save you some time on the mechanical integrity element, most facilities will end up using a preventative program. You want to make sure that you pick one piece of the covered process and print out all of the PMs for over the last 5 years. And what you want to do is make sure that the proper maintenance is being performed at the appropriate frequency or the manufacturer recommended frequency. And one thing to note is even though if a contractor performs maintenance, you want to make sure that the maintenance records are kept at the facility and is located somewhere within your CalARP or PSM or RMP binder. So the next element, the management of change. If there's been any not in-kind changes to the process, so basically if you make a change to the process that is not of the same kind, has there been a management of change form been completed, including training of the management of change? So in order to verify this, you want to check the MOC documentation, and again, you can pick one at random and verify that the MOC documentation has been completed and filled out. So along with the management of change, if there's been any modifications to your process or if a new regulated process is being constructed, was there a pre-startup safety review completed? So in order to check for this, you want to look at the PSSR documentation and make sure that a pre-startup safety review was completed for that MOC. When you perform a compliance audit, you want to make sure that a compliance audit is performed at least every 3 years, and that it lists the participants, and that the recommendations and follow-up closures are being performed. For California, you have 1.5 years to close out the recommendations, and generally the compliance audit is done to mimic an EPA or OSHA auditor. We will be taking a look at the program, the CalARP PSM or RMP program, to make sure that you're properly implementing that program and that you're keeping up with the documentation required for the program itself. For incident investigations, you want to make sure that there's a procedure that exists to investigate all incidents and near misses, and includes the following. You want to make sure that there's a requirement to initiate investigations within 48 hours following the incident. You want to make sure that the proper team members are included, that there's a development of the report, and if an incident occurs, you want to make sure that's communicated to all affected personnel, including contract workers. And if there's been an incident, you want to make sure that there's an incident report and that that report has been retained for at least, at a minimum, 5 years. For the employee participation, you want to make sure that there's a written plan for the participation of employees, which employees have access to. And you also want to make sure that the employees have access to the CalARP RMP PSM program information. And to verify this, you want to interview operators and make sure that they know the location of where they can find the CalARP RMP and PSM program. For hot work permits, you want to make sure that there's a procedure issued for any hot work that's being performed on the covered process, and that those hot work permits are being maintained as part of your CalARP RMP or PSM binder. In order to verify this, you want to take a look at previous hot work permits and make sure that they're being maintained as part of your documentation. Lastly, for contractors, you want to ensure that there's a policy to evaluate contractor records. If a contractor is being used or near the regulated process, you want to look for contractor records as part of the CalARP RMP or PSM binder or program. And you want to make sure that the contractors are evaluated prior to hiring and periodically after. So during the finalization or closeout meeting, following the compliance audit, you want to review the deficiencies with individuals that participated. You want to brainstorm how to improve the program and address any of those deficiencies. And if appropriate, you can assign the recommendations with the target completion dates as part of the closeout meeting. So for compliance audit recommendations, if deficiencies are found, a recommendation should be made. So following the compliance audit, these recommendations should be followed up and closed out, which include proper closeout comments. So here's an example of the way we currently track recommendations. We typically use an Excel spreadsheet, and we refer to this as an action tracking log. So on the left, you'll see that it contains the action ID or the recommendation number. To the right of that, you see the actual recommendation. So for example, in the recommendation 1, it includes, consider including a block flow diagram or P&ID as part of the process safety information section of the CalARP RMP PSM binder. So the proposed action or comments is where the responsible party typically describes how they closed out the recommendation. So for this example, a block flow diagram of the covered process is now incorporated as part of the process safety information. The target date and the person responsible is typically included as part of the closeout meeting, and then the completion date is when you completed the recommendation, and the status closed means that you've now closed the recommendation. So next we'll get into some common deficiency and misconceptions about your CalARP RMP and PSM program. So the program documentation versus implementation. So say for example, if you made a change to your process, was there a mechanical integrity documentation that was updated to reflect that change? Were training records performed on that change, including MOC or operating procedures or the pre-startup safety review, etc.? If there has been a change, were the operating procedures updated to verify the accuracy of the change? Were P&IDs updated to reflect that change? Additionally, if you made a change to the process, did you update the process safety information to include the new equipment that you included as part of the process? So you want to make sure that if a change is made to the process, you go back to your CalARP program, look at element by element, and make sure that any change is made where needed. You want to also ensure that the PHA is revalidated every 5 years, and it requires reviewing every line or every scenario and item from the past PHA to verify the accuracy. And PHA's compliance audit and seismic assessment recommendations, you want to make sure that those are closed out and include proper closeout comments. So for the recommendation follow-up, you want to assign an individual responsible for following up on the recommendation, assign an anticipated date of completion to each and every recommendation. So again, for California, you have a minimum or a maximum of 1.5 years to complete the recommendation following the compliance audit. And you want to document the actions taken for addressing the recommendation and label it as closed and state the date of completion. Here's an example of a recommendation action tracking log that we typically give for our facilities. As you can see, this has the PHA recommendations, the compliance audit recommendations, and the seismic assessment recommendations all combined into one Excel spreadsheet, so that makes it easier for the facility to track their recommendations. For recommendations follow-up, Federal OSHA has the following guidance for PHA findings. An employer can justifiably decline to adopt a recommendation where the employer can document in writing and based upon adequate evidence that one or more of the following conditions is true. So if the analysis upon which the recommendation is based contains factual errors. Number 2, the recommendation is not necessary to protect the health and safety of employees or contractors. 3, an alternative measure would provide a sufficient level of protection. 4, the recommendation is infeasible. So again, just because we give you a recommendation doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow up with that recommendation. You can justifiably decline to adopt the recommendation. So next we'll go over a recap or some tips for streamlining time-consuming compliance audits. So for P&IDs, you want to choose a representative sample of the system and verify the accuracy of that portion. For your mechanical integrity check, you want to choose a piece of equipment and go through and review the mechanical integrity records to make sure that all records are being performed and are done at the appropriate frequency. For your training, I would choose a random employee and make sure that you find the appropriate training documentation for that employee. For the operating procedures, I would pick an operating procedure at random and check for compliance. As I said earlier, when you pick an operating procedure, you walk it down with an operator to make sure that the steps documented on the procedure are being performed out in the field. For the PSSR and the MOCs, is there a master tracker for the MOCs? You want to interview operations to determine the most up-to-date MOC and make sure that an appropriate PSSR was filled for that MOC. For the recommendation schedule, you want to begin with the process safety information, the operating procedures, the mechanical integrity documentation review. Then you want to walk down with an operator to verify if the P&IDs are accurate as well as the operating procedures are accurate. Then you want to review the maintenance integrity records at the facility. Then you want to review all the other prevention program elements, including training documentation, employee participation, the PHAs, the MOCs, the pre-startup safety review, the compliance, the incident investigations, the hot work permits, the contractors, and the trade secrets. Next, we'll get into some interview techniques and tips. So for the operating procedures, you want to ask an operator to see how specific procedures perform out in the field and verify that it corresponds to what's written on the actual operating procedure document. For the employee participation, ask operators how they are involved in the RMP PSM program. Do they know where the program is? Are they adequately trained or aware of applicable elements such as the PSI, the mechanical integrity, or the MOC, etc.? For the incident investigation, you can ask them if they feel that they have been adequately trained on past incidents that have occurred at the facility. For the emergency action plan or the emergency response plans, you can ask an operator if they're aware of the EAP or ERP at the facility, and do you know where the evacuation meetup points are located, or if they had sufficient training, or do they feel like do they need more training? So things to remember: even if the facility performs all the actions of the recommendations, so for example installing sensors or labeling piping, etc., if the documentation that originally stated that recommendation is not updated, it is a deficiency. So you always want to make sure that you go back to your action tracking log and update that and make sure that you close it out and include proper closeout comments. So here's the prevention program lifecycle. So essentially, these are living documents. Deficiencies are bound to occur and procedures will change. So the idea of this program is to update and follow up in order to demonstrate that you're following the safety program. And typically, you improve or correct your program by performing triennial compliance audits, and you address those recommendations or those deficiencies from the compliance audit to make sure that you're following and implementing your safety program. For the compliance audit review, so for the compliance audit, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate team. You want to ensure that there's a method to document the results. We typically do that via a worksheet checklist, as I showed you previously. You want to ensure that the regular requirements are met. When you look at the CalArt program, you want to look and review for any supporting documentation. You want to look for program implementation. You want to be objective. You want to make sure that you follow up on recommendations. So with that being said, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to give me a call at 949-282-0123, extension 223, or feel free to give me an email at oscar.hernandez@rmpcorp.com. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll hope to see you on our next webinar.